about to bring on the positive vibe. Wherever we go, we are gonna do.
Hello, we're back. So we got a little delayed because, technical issues, but that's always and forever on me.
Technical issues don't make me very happy.
Well, I'm sorry. Listen, if you learned how to do this.
Whatever. Okay, we gotta move this.
We gotta move this. Be careful. Okay.
So now, all right. So we have 3 people have joined us so far now, but our guests can hear me or no?
They cannot hear us. So you're gonna talk. They can't hear anything. I have to bring them up on the screen.
What, can you just bring them up, please?
Okay.
Just please.
My goodness. We're back. Our people are back. One of our folks left. We'll join. We'll bring him back in. Oh, there he goes. Hold on. My husband gets very frustrated with the technical aspect of this. He does, but then he can't do it. So you just have to be mad.
Anyway.
Okay, go ahead.
So anyway, what we typically do during this hour for those look, we got a handful of people who have already joined us on Facebook Live. Thank you. Hopefully you got an opportunity to check out some of our earlier show. Absolutely phenomenal. As a matter of fact, I'm not even sure if we've had as many live viewers as we've ever had.
No, y'all had about 500 live views.
Yeah, so this is awesome. So we appreciate y'all sharing and going live and doing your own doing your own watch parties. So Facebook is the only one that allows you to do a watch party? You can't really do watch parties anywhere else, huh?
I don't know the answer to that, but I know you're able to do them.
All right, well, it's whatever. But let me just as folks are starting to kind of come online, let me just take a quick moment, recap what we're talking about today, introduce our panel. We obviously last week was historic, right? So Vice President Joe Biden made a decision that may, in fact, if conventional wisdom shows true, may just change the course of history.
Yes,
forever.
For sure.
Because not only was it the selection of an African-American female candidate for a running mate for vice president, but also someone who is poised to be the first female vice president.
Yes.
And by all indications, probably poised to be the next president of the United States after Joe Biden is done.
Sure.
And what's cool about that is, and this is my opinion, and it's my show, so I can share my opinion how I want. What's cool about that is that we talk about qualifications all the time, as if when we talk about people of color, we have to give them this caveat that says, and she's really, really qualified, as opposed to the individual that we have in the White House now. But if you look at kind of the background and resume of this particular individual, under normal circumstances, she absolutely would be considered a viable presidential candidate anyway.
Period.
Kind of on
Correct.
her own right. So that's what's most gratifying is it is a validation that probably even extends beyond President Barack Obama's validation, because if you remember, the original knock on him was he was this young freshman senator.
He didn't have enough
experience, and even within the party, there was a lot of pushback. So anyway, having said all of that, the swing voters in this election are going to be young voters. The swing voters are going to be between 23-ish and 35-ish years old. If that group comes out in droves, then this election probably is probably a lot. But when the selection of Senator Harris was made, that group has collectively, and even a little earlier today on our show, has collectively said, "Yeah, but what if we're just not all that excited about her?" Then,
right.
So then what, right? So we definitely want to hear from the panel on a couple of key issues that I want to get into, but I also want to welcome. Again, a gentleman who we had the pleasure and honor of meeting at his sister's wedding. DeMarc Liggins has started an organization called a movement, really called My 54. So really quickly, as before we kind of jump into today's subject, DeMarc, if you would be kind enough to just kind of rehash for our new audience and those who did not join us during the first hour, what exactly My 54 is.
Absolutely, and thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to share. In a nutshell, my54.org was born out of a friendship between myself and Mark Spat, who met at the Black and Jewish Coalition here in Atlanta, Georgia, in the wake of C.T. Vivian and John Lewis passing away on the same day, and trying to figure out what can we do. And we just started an initiative, hopefully to encourage people to think about what they would do 55 miles for. What would they put themselves in harm's way? What type of things would they go through personal angst for? What's their 54? We encourage people to go to my54.org and share their stories of how C.T. Vivian and John Lewis inspired them to be the change they want to see. And that's in a nutshell what the initiative is about in a very quick way. So thank you.
Thank you.
Awesome.
So I put it up there. I put it up there again. You all make sure that you are to our. I hope I got that website right. www.my54.org.
That is correct.
Make sure that you all go and sign up and check out what DeMarc is doing. So
outstanding. Okay, panel. Joining us on this panel is my daughter and my nephew, Alicia McDowell, former grad student at Harvard University and program manager. Brian Harris is my nephew, an educator, tuning in. Oh, and Alicia is tuning in from Washington, D.C., our nation's capital, Chocolate City. Brian Harris is tuning in from Chicago, our nation's, I don't even know how you describe Chicago anymore.
The shy. Oh,
man, we could probably spend an hour. And we may do that one day.
We're
gonna spend an hour one of these days talking about Chicago. What the hell is wrong with y'all?
Listen, I have too many too many friends that are from Chicago who love the shy, and I am not tipping my foot in that conversation.
We will get into that one as well. And then and Jasmine is tuning in all the way from California. She's a law student with ties to the Bay Area as well.
And DeMarc is in Atlanta, right?
And DeMarc is in. So we are, in fact, worldwide.
We are national, like coast to coast.
We are coast to
coast, top to bottom,
worldwide, with just a panel of sharp, educated young voters and activists. And one of the things that I got to tell you, I'm just dying. I'm tumbling a bit to get to this subject of race versus ideology. And what I mean by that is, and DeMarc talked about the legacy of John Lewis and the civil rights struggle and the March of Selma. So those of us who are old now, I was not a part of I wasn't old enough to participate in the civil rights movement per se. But when we start getting conversations with guys like yourselves, and we start to hear things like, well, of all of the primary candidates, the one that resonates and aligns more ideologically with me is Bernie Sanders, and we want to feel the burn, and we go, okay, what? Bernie is like 103 years old, right? And if it's not Bernie, it's Elizabeth Warren. Elizabeth Warren, the little short white school teacher looking lady from wherever she's from, Massachusetts, and she's like 93 years old. Like, we're going, wait, hold on, what is going on here? That ideologically, what happened to Cory Booker? What happened to Kamala Harris? Like, what is wrong with you people? So I absolutely want to hear ideology versus race. You guys have started drawing lines in the sand, and it's just confusing to us. Like, what was the appeal? What exactly is the appeal that made it such a strong conviction towards that?
Assuming, and you're making an assumption that everybody on here was a Bernie.
Yeah, but it's not an assumption though, because in some cases I know and I've heard that there were some supporters out there. Maybe not so much this time, but the last time around there were some supporters out there of Bernie and some supporters of Elizabeth Warren. But even beyond that assumption is your peer group, because you talk amongst yourselves and your peers told you loud and clear. We are feeling this Bernie Sanders message. We are really, really feeling this Elizabeth Warren message. So I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on ideology versus race. And I don't know who wants to jump in here and get some of that.
I can start. So as someone who was in graduate school, when
when the primaries kind of first started, and where you were being introduced to, well, I guess Bernie we've known about, but Elizabeth Warren and Cory Booker, and Kamala Harris. I think that their messages, while their entire platform we may or may not have agreed with, they have some key things that perked our ears. One was student loan forgiveness. Two was we did Elizabeth Warren, and I was just talking about this with my roommate, who's also an educator, was universal pre-K. A lot of us who are millennials now, we actually have young kids, like especially if you're in your late 20s, early 30s, we have pre-K age kids. And so that was something that was really resonating with us, is this idea that your 4-year-old could now be included in free public education. I know, as someone who is deeply in debt from school, y'all talking about forgiving my loans, and I'm like, oh, say less. So I think that they came out swinging with policies that we could see directly affect us most immediately.
Okay.
And Cory Booker and Kamala Harris did not do that. Like, they had their policies, but it was like, okay, so but what that got to do with me? And then especially when you think about Kamala, and I know we're going to talk about this a million times, but about Kamala's history as being a prosecutor, we also, as a lot of us, got locked up for these simple drug charges, and our peers or whatever, we just wasn't feeling that. We wasn't feeling her history. And then Cory Booker was just like, who are you? Like, why are you? Like, none of us resonate with Cory Booker at all. I mean, we can go into him being in New York and like the way that he presented himself, like the whole him trying to convince us that his house was in the hood and like all of this stuff. Like
there's a whole I'm gonna push back a little bit. There's a whole documentary when Cory was running for was he running for a Senate seat? No, he was running for maybe a state rep seat, whatever his initial election was. I don't remember what it is he was running against an incumbent, and I don't remember what it was. But he lives in Newark. He lives in, at least from the documentary, he lives in Newark. He lives in a housing project, and probably intentionally, because that is his district. That is where he lives. He lives there. So when he says that he understands and feels and knows, I admire him because he made an intentional choice to do that so he would be closer to his constituents. Now, I may not agree with him. Brick City, that was thank you, Bamitra. Bamitra's on here. So Brick City was the name of the documentary. I highly recommend it. So I got more respect for Cory Booker having watched that documentary. But anyway, I interrupted you. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, that was it. I can go ahead and let somebody else jump in.
So y'all weren't feeling y'all
like the brother because he light skinned it. That's all.
Light skinned with them bright ass eyes. What you?
Yeah, that's all it was. Say it.
Anybody else
jump in there?
I can jump in as a light skin myself. I think that there's for Cory Booker, I think there's a general distrust amongst our generation. We don't feel like he was allegiant to any particular policies that I think were considered progressive. I think we were uneasy with what we would perceive to be an allegiance to like a lot of corporate backing, particularly with like pharmaceutical companies. But so for context, I supported Bernie over Hillary pretty strongly in 2016. I did not really put my allegiance behind any of the candidates this election cycle, but the one who resonated with me the most was actually probably Julian Castro.
Interesting.
I heard a lot of people say that though.
Yeah. I felt like I felt like he was genuine in the things that he was advocating for, in a way that I did not get that sense from other candidates. And quite frankly, I felt uneasy with although like there are some things I line up with ideologically with Bernie and Elizabeth Warren, I'm one that absolutely, especially over time, is feeling increasingly uneasy with white people being the face of these values, when it really should be like, when you're talking about like values that disproportionately affect like young people of color, it needs to be people from our communities who are advocating for these things, which is why I think much more effective politicians are like AOC and Cori Bush, who just, who was recently, right? Like, she's from the communities advocating for those policies. I think that's more genuine. But I think here's one thing that I think helps contextualize our generation. I'm talking about like Gen Z and millennials, right? So for one, we're kind of defined by communication and our access to each other, right? So we grew up, millennials often, like, I think one thing that defines our generation is that like we're connected. We've always been connected via the internet, right? So it wasn't like a time where we couldn't like have access to all this information, right? So even though we don't know how to process it all the time, we have access to tons of information, and we have access to each other digitally all the time. Gen Z is even worse. So they got access on their phones. And I say this as an educator who's continuing with these phones every day. They're constantly on their phones. They're living entire lives on their phones, and there's even increased access. The other thing is, so my first election was 2008, right? So the first candidate I was able to vote for was Barack Obama, right? A lot of us, we haven't lived through a time where it wasn't possible to have a Black president.
Good point.
Whereas we see a lot of older generations talk about representation a lot, which makes sense because you all had to fight to just get a seat at the table in the first place, right? So that's something I understand. We kind of take that for granted because we've grown up with Black this, Black that. And for a lot of us, we haven't seen tangible change attached to those representatives, right? And so when you talk about race versus ideology, we're still often living in segregated communities. So it's not like we don't see race, but we are connected. We are able to connect with people from Atlanta and DC and all of these places a lot easier. So it's a lot easier for us to make connections on ideology when the people who are of the same race, who are supposed to be representing us in the place that we are not actually tangibly impacting our lives, right? And so that's the perception of a lot of young people. I think, and a lot of people that I talk to, particularly this generation coming up, there's a lot of anger amongst them from people directed towards people that look like them that are supposed to be that they think are supposed to be advocating for
them. Interesting.
Jasmine.
DeMarc, before I move to Jasmine, are you a millennial? Are you? Because I didn't ask you how old you were. Because my mom is from Memphis. I think that's inappropriate. So what generation are you in?
No lady.
Well, I don't ask you how old you are. Period.
I was born in 78, so
okay,
so I'm not. There are differing opinions. I'm either an incredibly old millennial, or I would be a really young generation
Xer?
Generation X.
Okay.
I don't really get too much into it. I let other people tell me where I sit.
Okay.
But I know that I got a lot of gray hair and kids. So
okay. So you're the younger-ish voter. But I'm gonna bring DeMarc in. But Jasmine, same thing with this whole race ideological viewpoint that Keith was talking about. What are your thoughts about that?
I think that like when it comes to my political views, I'm very progressive. And I think that that's an interesting place to be, particularly when you're talking about like Black people and Black, just be specific, Black people, because a lot of traditional Black political views are conservative. And so when you think about that, and like when I have conversations, my granddad's probably watching this. When I have conversations with my granddad and we're talking about, how we view things, we're coming from two different perspectives. We're both Democrats at the end of the day, but we're coming from two different perspectives as to what is influencing our political needs, our political ideologies. So when looking at candidates, I don't know. I mean, I keep thinking about when Rep. Clyburn wrote that letter to get all the like older Black people to vote for Joe Biden.
I was upset. I was mad. I literally was like, Granddad, this is not okay. Like, why is he doing this? This is not the move for us. Like, at that point, Kamala Harris was out the race. I was a Bernie bro, whatever you want to call him. I was all in for Bernie. And I was just like, this is not okay. Like, the policies that, in my opinion, the policies that Joe Biden was pushing forward at that time were not progressive enough for me. They were in the middle, and it just wasn't where I saw myself in the party. Mm-hmm. And so just even having those conversations, those generational conversations, and seeing what influences and influence how we see ourselves in America, how we see, what our values are. So there are ideologies that we have based on our race, but there's also ideologies that we have based on our age, based on our gender, that all come into play. And I think they're all important, and we have to grapple with all of those different things weighing on us when we're thinking about what candidates we want to support, what policy we want to support, and how we go about expressing ourselves.
So, DeMarc, you're probably more. This is an assumption I'm going to make, because we are only 3 years apart. So I'm going to assume that your viewpoint is probably more aligned with Keith and I's, but I still want to get your. I would love to hear your perspective and see whether or not it leans more towards what these the young people are saying, or kind of what we, because I vote black. I vote black first, and this is probably.
That's because she's racist.
Stop saying that on people. Stop saying it to the people. Oh, okay. So I vote black first. I'm being honest. I vote black first, and then I take a look at. I'm not probably. Listen, I support black first. Let me change that. I support black first, and then I'm going to look at your platform and see whether or not it aligns with my ideologies. And if it doesn't, then I'll switch. But I tend to look at color first and look at black first, because I recognize that representation is needed within the political environment. I also recognize all skin ain't kin. So it's kind of that. I'm looking at black first. Where do we align? Mm-hmm. And then if we aren't aligned on the same level, then I'm gonna vote for somebody else. So DeMarc.
Well, for the record, I think I vote very much in terms of that thought process. I will say that my thought process, kind of when you look at the kind of the landscape, is a lot of things get trapped up because of social media. Yeah. There's just seems to be honest, just this kind of new peer pressure. I just think peer pressure generates differently through generations. I think that even in this conversation, I'm curious, is probably the word I'm looking for, about conversations about values-based voting. Do you live an authentic life? So on and so forth. But then I'm not suggesting people should love Cory Booker. That's not what I'm saying. But then when you're presented with like, hey, that brother lived in the projects. Mm-hmm. And I've heard Senator Booker, and I'm not suggesting that he's the world's most progressive person, but I think sometimes the conversation gets, this person represents this thing, and then we stop paying attention to the actual stuff about them. It just gets more. How does a person get to be labeled branded progressive? And once that brand gets there, they get to keep it. Once a person gets branded centrist, they get stuck there. Right. How do we kind of break out of those spaces? And are we really looking at their platforms? Or are we just kind of hearing what the echo chambers are? Oh, that person is centrist. That person is progressive. More than likely, as people start to govern, you just find that they end up having to become centrist, mm-hmm. because unfortunately, as much as it frustrates me as a Black person who really, really likes Blacky things, we don't live in a vacuum. And so to get the things that we want for Black folks, a lot of times when I'm executing those points, I have to become a centrist to get the votes I need to get the things I want, right? And so I think that's just a thing that, how do you get out of how do we all just kind of stay centered in our own space? And are we really making sure that the folk that we don't think are progressive have not moved? I think that somebody had mentioned that earlier about how Senator Harris has had this kind of progression in her own life. And are we paying attention to those changes? I think is for somebody who's kind of in between it, as much as I think that there's this belief that social media keeps everything real, it also makes its own big echo chambers where we really have to make sure we kind of hear through the clutter. And I'm just really big on that. So for me, Another thing I wanted to just make a point. I do think, and I think Brother Harris, you said it really well when you were talking about in your lifetime what you've got to vote for. I think sometimes it's really hard for people that are younger than myself to understand how hard it would be for some of the quote unquote Black candidates to really be this out loud person and you still know their name, right?
Yeah.
Because we don't get the space that an 80-year-old white man would get to say that stuff. We don't get the space to be able to be as left as a Bernie, or to be as left as an Elizabeth for that matter. Because if we did that, our voice would just be minimized and you would have never heard of us anyway. And I just think and that's not an excuse, but I think that's something if you're trying to be a progressive leader, you have to think about, I do want to be heard, and I don't necessarily always get the same right. The privilege is real. And I just think that a lot of people inside their privilege get to be a little bit more left because they come from a demography where they get to be more left, and that's not something that minimizes them.
Oh, go ahead.
So I'm curious. Okay, Alicia, go ahead, Alicia, jump in, because I want to put Brian on the spot a little bit as well, based on the comment that he made during our first hour. Go ahead.
I just want to piggyback off that because I think that is very valid. I'm also thinking about how radical the younger part of the millennial generation has gotten, and how that's no longer acceptable for us. Like the whole, like if we're considering you, like you're a Black candidate, you get into the forefront, we know your name, we're going to want you to come out swinging with the things that we aligned with. And I'm not saying, I'm still on the fence on like whether that's good or not, but we are no longer like accepting like, oh, well, I had to compromise with this conservative and that conservative to be able to get on the platform to even get as far as I get. We're like, no. And I think I'm probably the most radical person in this chat, and probably more the viewers. Like I'm unapologetically like abolish prisons, abolish the police, all that good stuff. So when we have candidates that come out or not even candidates, but even elected officials, I think about how our favorite Mayor Keisha, when during the Atlanta protest, she came out, I think one of the first things she says is like that this was, disrespectful and that this was unacceptable. And I think she turned around a little bit later on, and she like fired the police chief or whatever, but it was just like, nah, sis, like we out here sitting here trying to protest for all of these victims of police brutality. And the first thing you do is come out and say like, oh, we need to be working with the police, stop destroying the neighborhood, this, that, and the third, which is perfectly aligned with, I think, a lot of, especially like older, more conservative Black folk, because, y'all are not as radical as we are, but we just are no longer compromising with that. Like we want what we want, and we're not, if you're not on it, then we just gonna turn it. It don't matter if you Black or not. We just gonna turn to who is gonna support the ideals that we have.
So I would like to push back a little bit. I respect that and I receive that. I think the challenge that I have, and I can only speak for myself, is that I was radical in college because I ain't had no bills to pay, right? I mean, I'm just being real. I didn't have any bills to pay. I had no responsibility. So in college, I was protesting, sitting down. I can't speak for your father. I will assume that he did the same thing. But we were protesting. So probably not as radical, but we were vocal. I'm still vocal. But I think to DeMarc's point, you have to shift a little bit. So you have to be a little bit, if you're trying to really move the needle, you can scream and scream and scream, but you also want to move the needle. And so to your point where you're saying, I received that. I think the young people that are protesting, I've said repeatedly, continue to protest. The problem is that what I saw in the primary is Bernie had a whole lot of people speaking out on his behalf, attending his rallies, donating money. And then when it came time for them to go to the ballot box to vote, they did not vote. And so I received the being unapologetic in your positions, that you want what you want and you speaking out loud. But if you're not going to use that same voice in one vote to hold folks accountable when they are elected and get in their faces, and or three, run for office and get the people get the people that are aligned with your values to support you, then all of this, in my opinion, is for naught. So like, for instance, Corey, what's the young lady's name in St. Louis? Is it St. Louis?
Corey Bush.
Cori Bush completely outspoken, ran the first time, and she's progressive. She's unapologetic in her positions, but she's running for office, and people are supporting her, and she won. And so I'm telling the folks that are here on the ground, y'all out in the front of the police station protesting and fighting with the Blue Lives Matter people, that's cool. If you don't like who the mayor is, find somebody within your group to run against her. Find someone within your group to run for city council.
Because the problem is when they do that, we don't get as much support as we need. Though. You think about like the capital that's needed, the relationships that are needed. Yeah, my group of 50 young Black people can scream and holler about this person, how they need to be in office. But if we don't have the support of the more conservative folks, the older folks with like y'all that actually have the money to do so, then it's not going to go anywhere. And I do want to say, like, we came out and voted for Hillary, and we still lost because of the Electoral College and the way that our system is set up is messed up. And so I think a lot young people right now are feeling very frustrated because we have this idiot in the office, and the voting just hasn't felt like it's worked.
I want to come back to that point, panel, because there is a disaffected population of young voters who don't see their vote as counting and don't see elections as counting. And I do want to unpack that a little bit.
Jasmine and then Mark.
Well, no, and I still want to talk.
Oh, and Brian, I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Jasmine.
Yeah.
Unmute yourself.
Yeah, I was just going to say, so I definitely see myself on the more radical part of the spectrum. However, like I have experience working in the activist setting, and then I also have experience working in the government setting. And the thing is, if we don't have the seats in government to move forward legislation, then if we don't have the people there, Black, white, in between, whatever, if we don't have the people on the side of the progressive legislation that we want, it's not going to move. So that's why it's so important for us to have activists in the streets pushing elected officials to move. However, if that's all we have, if all we have is the activists without the legislators to back it up, we don't move. It dies after a while because, I mean, realistically speaking, the protest movement is gonna go up, it's gonna go down, it's gonna go up, it's gonna go down, especially when people have to go back to work, when people have to start doing like other stuff, it's not gonna die out, but it's gonna go down or whatever, and it's gonna come back up and it's gonna go down. When you think about local elections, so just to take a step back from the presidential election, if you have one Black person or one progressive person on a city council, you have one Black person or one progressive person on a county commission, or you have one Black person or a couple Black people in the state representative state senate, that's one vote on a body of 6 or 7 or 40 or 50 people, one vote. And you have to have a majority of votes in order to pass legislation. So we can put Cori Bush in Congress, which is great, and we need her there. But if we still have a Senate that's majority of people that don't value the same things that we value, we're never going to get legislation. We're going to have people fighting for legislation for us, but the legislation isn't going to pass. We can have a HEROES Act sitting in the House passed, and the Senate can be on vacation.
Yeah, you're right.
So it's a balancing. I think somebody said in the comments, it's a balancing act on how to put the people that we want with our ideas in office in order to make the votes happen. How we get there, I don't know, because the election system is crazy. You mentioned the Electoral College does not work in our favor. It actually works in the favor of conservatives because of how the states are set up. So
I want to make sure that a comment that Brian made during our first hour, I want to make sure that we're not talking about the same thing, because he said, 4 years ago, I was this, my attitudes have become more nuanced over time. And I really would like to understand kind of what that is. I'll share a real quick personal testimony. So I was in college and took an advanced econ class from a black professor, went to Florida A&M. And he started breaking down, supply side economics, and here's how things work. Here's marginal revenue equals marginal this. So we started going there, and we were sitting up there, eyes kind of big, like, oh, so that's how it works. So you mean money just doesn't really just kind of come from the sky? And he could just tell by the spirit of our questions. He finally got comfortable enough to us to say, yeah, y'all all be Republicans before y'all leave here. And he said it like he was kind of almost tongue in cheek. But by the time we finally got educated on kind of how our economy works, we were like, you know, we probably more fiscally conservative than we are not. So so I'm just curious. Yeah, so my attitudes over time absolutely became more nuanced. Brian, I'm curious to hear how your attitudes have become more nuanced as well.
So I wouldn't say that they have become more nuanced in the sense that I've become more conservative. I'm right there with Cuzzo on abolish this, abolish that. I don't think I have become any less radical since I was first radicalized. I think there's just nuance added to that radicalism in terms of just like how that manifests in terms of like the values that I espouse. So for instance, in 2016, so I've always had a community of folks of color and Black folks specifically, a radical Black community surrounding me, who are like espousing similar values. You know, when we talk about like basic rights for all, you know, everyone should have food, everyone should have healthcare, we're advocating for reparations, like all of these things, right? So I've had that community. But one thing that I realized after 2016 or since 2016, I was like, you know what, my community is not necessarily representative of everyone, right? Not only like in society, but in the Black community. And so you have to decide, like, I just got tired of like, I don't want to argue with my own people, right? I want to build with my own people. But at the same time, I have to acknowledge that that is not where necessarily the majority of my people are at. So like I got more and more uncomfortable in these spaces where we were developing coalitions where like, you know, there was only maybe a handful of Black folks, right? And that's a problem to me. Because you can't claim to be advocating for a community and then the community is not even there with you, right? That don't make sense to me, right? That's where the nuance is. And so I've definitely gotten more into, and that's why, again, I mentioned AOC, who was coming from a community that she, you know, has had experience with, right? Cori Bush, I'm so excited for Cori.
Yeah, I am too.
And I think, to be honest, like the Bernie wing, like the Justice Democrats, they also made a kind of a pivot, I think, in they are more advocating for people from the communities that they're talking about. They're utilizing that strategy. And I think that's a good move because Bernie is not, the old white man is not going to lead the revolution. Old white man is not going to lead the revolution. He needs to get out the way. And one of the reasons I didn't vote for him this time, so I was mad. I was like, you should have never ran. It should have been, if we should have had, if like your values, and we disagree on certain things, right? Because he takes like a class-based perspective to things that I think need racial nuance in them. But I do like some of your values, but it shouldn't be coming from your mouth. And you should know that. You talk about like you were part of the civil rights movement, all that. You should have never ran in the first place, right? So that's where my nuance is coming in.
That's good. DeMarco, I want to get you in on the conversation because you were going to, in reference to the prior conversation that we were having, I think that you wanted to say something.
Well, I did. I just, my question is probably more of a you know, and I'm so excited because I don't get to talk to people like this a lot. But my question is, and I think it was I can't read it because is it Alicia? Mm-hmm. Alicia, my question for you is, you know, and I think I'm like Monica. I fully respect everybody's opinion. I'm really like that. But you got kind of mentioned this very all or nothing position where we're not standing for certain things, and I think that. How comfortable as a leader, you start having these kind of conversations with yourself, not so much what my all is, but how comfortable am I with nothing, right? Because when you walk into a room and dare people to say, hey, it's all or nothing, 95% of the time, you're going to get nothing, right? Because you insist on, if I don't get the fullness of what I want, I'm willing to get nothing, right? And so when you talk about that, hey, and I'm not saying it's against, it's a curiosity question. But when you talk about like, hey, we're frustrated with people who get into these spaces and they just can't be 100% no compromise, which is fine. how comfortable are you with how many times they're going to walk back to you and say, well, hey, I walked into that room to get everything. I did not compromise, so I got nothing in my hand, right? We had 50 things we wanted. I got 0, but I kept it real. I kept it real, bro. I kept it real. I didn't acquiesce, but I got 0. But I'll go back tomorrow. And they come back tomorrow like, hey, bro, I kept it real. Hey, sis, I kept it real, but I got 0. And after a while, you're like, well, hey, man, can we get 5 of those things? And I'm not suggesting it happens. I'm just curious as to that and the other conversation where you're like, well, we have these values, but if we run our candidates the way we want to, they don't get funded. That also is in that same conversation of trying to figure out as much as you can be yourself, but kind of playing in that sandbox of people who have resources, influence, and everything else. It's nuanced, I think is the word that we've been using, and just kind of your reflections on that curiosity.
Yeah, I don't think I understand completely what you're saying. I don't think that for us it's all or nothing. It's just that we've gotten to a point now where the continual compromise we realize actually isn't moving us in the direction that we want. And so the example that comes to mind for me is surrounding like criminal justice reform. I think I'm kind of past the point of criminal justice reform because the same shit keeps happening. Like, yes, we can put body cams. Like, I think so. A good compromise, I think, was like putting body cams on police officers. And I know that was a big celebrated thing in the counties and where that was enacted, or the states that where that was enacted. Like, okay, so we've been saying like we want to end police brutality. I think the more radical people were like, yo, we need to just figure something out. We need to fire all of those officers. We need to, I don't know how many people at the time were saying like, we need to, completely shut down this police station or whatever. But I think one big compromise we had was like body cams and more accountability training and all of these things that for the past like couple of decades were like our compromise of this, of how we were going to deal with unarmed Black and brown people being murdered at the hands of police. And we realized like that shit is not what we like. That's actually not getting us to where we need to go. And so we actually are still ending up with nothing because we just had a slew of protests in which we were still because we still had to protest for justice for people being murdered. So I don't think that we go in there with like all or nothing. We're just understanding that the compromises that are being presented are actually compromises. They're just keeping us complacent. And so that's kind of mine.
I would love to add on to that if I can.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, I wanted to check with the host.
No, you're fine. This is a free for all. Go ahead.
Okay. So I want to co-sign that and also add on to it. So I think a lot of young people, and again, I point back to the one that like we're inundated with a lot of information, which is not necessarily to say like, although I think that there is some entitlement, there's some arrogance involved with that. That's just part of being young because right? But sometimes like young people understand things a lot more than they're given credit for, I think. And so I think, at least in my circles, people tend to look at things from a systemic perspective and like consider the perspective of like a young person. This is not even like my circle. This is more like my kids' circles. And by my kids, I almost talk about my students. That was my kids. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So imagine, you grew up in the hood. Your mama grows up in the hood. Your grandma's in the hood, right? And you see all types of different candidates espousing different things over the years, and you are still in the same situation, right? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Incentive do you have to participate in the system? You've heard every single promise, right? These are the disaffected. These are the people who aren't voting, right? Yeah. Because they don't see actually any evidence year after year after year. And in Chicago, it's all Democrats. We've seen Democrats from different ways. We have a Black mayor right now, right? We've had white mayors in the past, and there's no tangible difference. People still broke, right? Schools are still terrible, right? Cyclical poverty. So that's one part of it. And then in terms of like all or nothing, I don't think it's necessarily a stance that says all or nothing. It's more of this. I'm part of I'm presenting my stance as a negotiation tactic, right? And so I think of one of the alderman that I just previously voted for, who won in the last election, Jeanette Taylor, who's an activist within the community on the south side of Chicago, who participated in she's done hunger strikes to keep schools open. She is really big on fighting gentrification within our community. So I voted for her knowing that her base stances is that everyone should have housing, right? And that I know what her base stances are uncompromisingly. Now, she just cut a deal with our mayor to expand affordable housing mandates from like 20 to 30%, which is not like the most ideal thing. But I know when she's coming to the negotiation table, I know what she's starting with, that everybody should have affordable housing.
Right.
Because I don't want you to start with, oh, we'll just expand affordable housing 5%, because then we're going to settle somewhere at like 2%. But when you're starting at everybody should have it, I know you're likely to get, when you come back to the negotiating table and say, hey, we were allowed to increase this 10%. I know that was probably the best that you could have got in that situation. So I don't think people are necessarily going in all or nothing. People just want to know what values are you starting with.
And so I would say that I think that mindset is kind of why we have, because like we mentioned this on the first show, about the fact that this group of folks, the young folks, are okay with Kamala being the pick because they feel fundamentally that she'll be able to move. I mean, she's a HBCU grad. I know that she was probably involved in a protest for apartheid in South Africa, because that was going on when she went to Howard.
Absolutely.
And Howard has a history of being engaged and involved in protests. She's a member of Divine Nine. So I think, to your point, I think I was happy for lots of different reasons. She checks boxes that are similar to my boxes that I check. But what I've noticed in terms of, there was the 19th, which is an editorial space that is the CEO, I think, is a Black woman. Her name is Erin. I forgot her last name. But she interviewed Senator Harris tomorrow. It's called the 19th. It's on our Soul Purpose page. Highly recommend that you check it out. But what was so intriguing to me is that she is talking about things that Joe Biden can't talk about because, he makes his gas and gets too comfortable, like he's the uncle coming to the picnic and saying stuff that he just fundamentally cannot say as a 77-year-old white man. Kamala can say that, right? Because even though people want to put her on this litmus test of how Black she is, which I think is stupid, she's able to say Black Lives Matter and it not feel, at least for me, and you all tell me whether or not you all disagree, if you all agree with this, she can say Black Lives Matter and it not feel like she's being inauthentic. She can talk about HBCUs and the importance of HBCUs, and people really feel that, right? I think that she needs to explain and have her surrogates explain her record as a prosecutor. I fundamentally don't have a problem with it because I'm a lawyer and I understand the reason, but I think that because you all are where you all are, you all and your voices and your desire not to be unapologetic in your positions and unwavering are pushing the Democratic Party to be where it needs to be. The fact that AOC is a speaker, even if it's for 60 minutes, she got 60 minutes to shine, right? So even if AOC is going to be speaking at the DNC next week, that to me is huge, because when she first came into Congress, the old school establishment was like, okay, I just need you to be quiet. Right. I just need you to hush and kind of figure out your way. And AOC, to Alicia and Brian and Jazz's point, is no, that's not. I have constituents that elected me to come here and speak. Right. So you have the whole squad that's doing that. So I said all that to say that I think your point in terms of focusing on the systemic issues that we all know are there, and your unapologetic nature of sitting at the table and saying this is what we want, is helping push, and being unwavering to a certain extent in that position is pushing the Democratic Party to be where it needs to be to get to having more progressive stances on certain issues. So that was a whole soliloquy, but I want to, I don't want you all to get, I know that you all will vote because you've already established that you will. I know there are sections of your friends that will vote, but that disaffected piece of the voting populace that we need is crucial. Like Andrew somehow, when he was running for governor, was able to get those folks out.
Andrew Gillum.
Andrew Gillum, who ran for the gubernatorial seat in Florida, was able to get those folks out. Now, in the primary, now the DNC came in. I don't know what happened under the undercurrent that changed the dynamic there. But at least in the primary, he was able to get the dudes in Miami that, you know, grills full with locks that when you look at them don't necessarily look like the typical voter, were saying to me, who was campaigning for him, oh, I got him, I'm voting for him. What does Kamala have to do? Because Biden's not going to be able to do it. So I mean, he's ahead, but he ain't going to be able to do it. What does Kamala and the team need to do to get those folks out, in your opinion?
So okay, so I know we're coming up on the hour.
We can go a little bit further because I want to know the answer to the question.
I get it, I understand
Okay.
it, but I also want to just throw out though to this particular panel, and obviously I think it's DeMarc's turn to weigh in, but I find it interesting how we started out this conversation talking about folks like John Lewis, right? And Reverend Vivian. And we also started talking about the fact that these people were 20, 21, and 23 years old doing the damn thing, right? So, and they also went into it with this uncompromising, we have had enough, you know, no more compromises, no more, you know, scraps. Like, we're going to sit here until we get arrested and get thrown in jail and get dogs turned on us, et cetera, et cetera. I like that when probably my most, and I wasn't alive, but as you read look at the documentaries, probably the one that haunts me the most is when there was a phone call from President Kennedy and his brother Robert, and they called Dr. King to have a conversation with him, to ask him, Dr. King, you're at a place now where these things have gotten so large, we can't provide enough federal protection enough to make sure that you guys are safe, and so we're needing you to kind of pare back on it enough to give us time to catch up to you so that we can keep you safe. And Dr. King was like, nope, that's really kind of not my problem. That's not my concern. So yes, we know that when we show up that we're going to be outmanned. We know that they're going to be that we're going to be hurt, and some of us will be killed. Y'all got to figure that out, because what he knew is that the cameras are rolling, and as long as the cameras are rolling, it's going to continue to put that pressure. So I just want to say, I respect the hell out of this group. I respect this panel. I respect how y'all approach things. I'm not here to say pare back at all or compromise. But anyway, but I just wanted to hear DeMarc's thoughts on, as someone who has studied the whole nonviolent approach and the nonviolent resistance. I just want to hear your approach on that perspective.
Well, I think that it's important when you kind of contextualize your Reverend Vivian's, Dr. King. One of the things that they were doing that we're not really doing now, they were holistically saying how they felt, right? Black folks couldn't vote back then, right? Mm-hmm. So their concept of integrating into politics was different. So they weren't as concerned about, like what Jasmine was talking about, by, well, how many seats do we have? We couldn't vote, right? So the whole conversation was different. And one of the things I think we should all put our thoughts around is, now that we can vote, not doing that to our politicians. Politics is inherently a reactive entity. Yes, we can proactive from the outside, but one of the frustration points is always going to be the reality of what Jasmine talked about, what happens when I go to vote when it's my one vote. My one vote over here is a thing, but we do have to focus on our whole communities. I think, Brian, you were talking about kind of how it feels in Chicago, which is very much echoed across the whole country, where you have Democratic, let's be real, like most Black cities have been ran by Democrats for quite some time. Why are we not getting what we want? Well, it's because as a community, instead of doing that, Dr. King, let us focus on our whole community. We do keep bringing our advocacy as 100% energy, trying to stuff it into politics. And then the grind of politics is kind of diminishing what we're really looking for as a group. I think politics is super important. I think we should always be engaged in it. But our communities are more than who we go vote for. I think we've got to make sure that we bring our activism as a whole person and keep it that way, right? But I think that we will never get what we need out of our communities simply trying to get it out of politics, because nobody else is getting their stuff that way. Getting what you want as a community is engaging your politicians, is engaging your faith community, is engaging your business community, is examining your own cultural kind of temperament that you've allowed to kind of solidify in your communities and some other things. So I just think that when you look at a Dr. King, one of the things you have to just remember is since they could not vote, politics was not necessarily, they just wanted to get the right to vote. That's why they were like, we can't vote. And I do think that we have struggled as a community to some degree about once we gain that right to vote, and up to and including the majority around us, where they would have listened to a Dr. King. Now the majority groups are go, well, what does the Black people who got represented think? And that becomes really kind of complicated, because I don't even know if necessarily all your Black elected officials are the best people to holistically say what the Black community feels. And, you know, I mean, I could go through a million different anecdotes where even in my own space, I've had people come and say, well, I walked into this community, I talked to the Black elected officials, they like this, we introduced it to Black folk, and now Black folk are mad at me. And, and I'm like, yeah, because you also need to talk to Black folk, not just Black elected officials, though they are part of that conversation. They're not the totality of who we are as a people, and respect our complexity. Don't just stuff us into these easy boxes because that's easy for you to do. We get the right to be every bit as complex and nuanced as all the other groups.
Absolutely. So before we close, because we started a little bit late, so I do want to hear from Alicia, Brian, and Jasmine. We have the ticket. The goal is to beat Trump, which I think we all agree with. There are a group of disaffected folks, and there are some folks who may not necessarily be disaffected for whatever the issues are, but there may have to be some educated Black folks that are just like, I'm not sure if I'm going to vote here. So what does the ticket, because there are people that I know personally that are with the campaign that are watching, what does the ticket and the campaign have to do to mobilize and energize you all to talk to your friends, to get folks to work and be involved? I mentioned this to Keith before we came back. I remember being actively involved with Obama, right? There was a level of energy with the Obama campaign that could really come. I think if everybody's excited, at least to the most part, about this ticket, Obama had a different type of energy. Maybe it's because he was speaking hope and whatever. But I canvassed for Obama. I walked the neighborhoods for Obama. I volunteered for Obama. I plan to do the same thing for Biden-Harris, but my life is different, so I don't have the same time. Y'all are younger. And so there's a whole group of young folks, Parkland, Gen X, millennials, Gen Zs, who are able to vote. What is it that the campaign needs to do to get you all to have that same level of energy and excitement? Even if you can't emulate Obama, we need Obama level numbers. And so what is it that the campaign can do? And any one of y'all can start. Nothing? Okay.
I can.
Go ahead, Brian.
You go ahead, Ali. Oh, okay. I'll start. So the short answer is nothing, because there is where young people's ideologies are is very, very different in 2008 compared to now. So like even Obama, like running right now, like young people don't even really mess with Obama like that. So just because ideologically there's a lot of differences. So like unless Biden and Kamala fundamentally like change their platform to be like, yeah, we need to defund the police and redirect that money elsewhere. Yeah, we need to like release everybody. I know Alicia and I are like abolish prisons entirely, but like even like release all nonviolent offenders. Like I'm gonna promise to do that day one. Like they're not gonna do that, right? One, because that would probably alienate certain segments of the population that you need to vote for you, right? Because ultimately, like we're 13% of the population. Like it sucks, but we gotta cater to white folks to some extent on a national stage, and like they're the ones holding us back. It's not, but that's a whole nother. However, I will say that like when Kamala was announced, I got a text from one of my homies, and he's like, man, I wish the first Black woman elected wasn't, like, for lack of a better term, wasn't a cop. Like he was mad, right? Literally the next day, he's like, "Hey, do y'all wanna like contribute with me? I'm phone banking in Florida." Like it's not lost on, I think, a lot of us how important it is to get people to vote. And I think what you will see is a lot of activists are going to really be mobilized around getting people to vote. It's just not going to be like espousing the benefits of Kamala and Biden. Now, what I will also say to your point about like Andrew Gillum and him engaging like people in Miami with the grills and everything. That is the real key, right? You have to go to places that people historically have not been going because these people have not been voting, right?
Right.
So one of the things that, and I know I'm rambling, I'm gonna try to cut it short. One of the things that Bernie did that he got consistently wrong, he would always tout, we're getting like new people to vote, which was not true. What he was getting was young people who could vote for the first time who were already predisposed to voting, as opposed to activating people who were not voting, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's a difference, right? Activating people who are not voting, these people are contending with survival. So you talk that speaks to people's survival. On day one, are you going to put food on my table? Are you going to make sure that I'm able to pay my medical bills? Are you going to make sure that I'm able to survive? Because if you're going to talk this abstract policy stuff that really I can't even recognize as impacting my community, they're not trying to listen, right? Mm-hmm. And so I would advocate framing a campaign about like, what are you going to do for me day one? And then I think you can engage more people who are really not connected to the political process.
That's awesome. Alicia and then Jasmine.
Yes. So ditto what Brian said. I mean, in short, they're probably not going to say what they need to say to get the majority of us out in droves to support them. However, yes, we are going to mobilize to get people to vote. Me and my roommate were just talking about what initiatives we can do, even like in our apartment complex, because we all stuck at home anyway, to get people registered to vote and go. And, regardless of, us particularly supporting Biden Harris. I was just jotting down, I'm like, what do I think like the majority of Black people care about right now? I think number one is like COVID response. Like kind of what Brian was saying on day one, what are you going to do about COVID? Because that is fucking everybody else, like all of us up right now. So our unemployment, and usually I think we usually don't care as much as about like unemployment plans, but because it's so high right now, we're like, okay, what are you going to do to get people back working right now? Without risking their health. And I think that the response now is not, is more so like, it feels less like y'all actually care about people working and more like, how are y'all making sure like these big corporations are able to continue making billions of dollars? So it cannot be whatever, and I'm not an economist, so I don't know how to frame that, and that your response really is, no, this is not for like big corporations to continue making money. This is really for making sure that we are decreasing this unemployment, this extremely high unemployment rate right now. Are getting people back working. I think we care about debt forgiveness, especially young people. I talked about that before. We are drowning, y'all. Like, can I just like be real for a second? Like, we're drowning in debt. And right now, any candidate that's coming out and saying, I'm here for this, for a detailed plan to, up to $50,000, up to $20,000, whatever, of student loan debt forgiveness, like, that actually might make me like, if like Kamala tomorrow came out and said, y'all, for real, day one, like I didn't put my blood on the paper, like for real, y'all, we're forgiving student loans, y'all, I might tattoo her name across my forehead. No, seriously, and it's because these are things that are impacting us so, like heavily right now. Not some, as Brian mentioned, like some abstract plan about how you were going to stimulate the economy, whatever. Because when I hear stimulate the economy, I hear I hear capitalism. I hear like how we're going to line the pockets of the already rich. I need something that's going to affect me as an individual. And then like some type of like anti-racist policy. Like right now, we're coming off the droves of these protests. We need something, and I know nobody's going to come out and say, you know, defund the police, especially Harris. She's not going to say abolish prisons or whatever. But we need some type of like really left approach to something that is specifically affecting Black and brown people. And I don't know what exactly that looks like because I'm not a political strategist, but we need something. We need something that we think that we can actually hold them accountable for once they get put in office.
Good, awesome. Jasmine?
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with what Brian and Alicia said. Only things that I can add, in 2016, I worked 2 campaigns and I volunteered heavily for the Hillary campaign after the primaries had ended. And like what I learned from that, specifically working with the state attorney campaign, is that outreach and education are so important. A lot of the, like you said, like us college educated people, 9 times out of 10, we're going to vote. You know, one way or the other, we're going to go out there and actually participate in the voting process. But for the people that aren't voting in those communities that have been traditionally disenfranchised, going to them and talking to them about how their individual lives connect with whatever office a person is running for, and in this case, the presidential office, but whatever office is on the ballot, directly letting them know this person is directly responsible for how a person is going to be charged if they're going to be charged once they get arrested. Bottom line, your life has been touched by this person. If you know anybody that has went to jail, this, like being very direct in your outreach. Also, like we talked about earlier, there's just a lot of misinformation, particularly on social media. Anybody can post anything on social media and they can be like, it's valid. What the campaign needs to do is make sure that they are putting out what their platforms are. They're putting it out in easy to discern ways. They're putting it out in videos, short to the point, so that people are always seeing face to face what they're about, what their policies are, what they've done in the past, and how they align with what their policies are now, how they have been moving from more right to left with like the coalition meetings between the Bernie people and the Biden campaign. Like, we need to see that, because if we don't see it, then it's like it's not happening. And like, everybody's not listening to podcasts or watching the news every day like some people are. So you have to put that in their face so that they know what's going on. The other thing is coalition voting and accountability. We may not all agree on, like, as far as like Black people, we may not all agree on what we want from our different elected officials. But what I can tell you is right now, Congress is 78% white. 78%. This is the most diverse Congress we have ever had, ever, in 2020. A goal for us as a coalition is to change that. Like, we have to set goals for stuff like that so that we can work to put more people that represent us, whether it's politically, racially, gender-wise, in those positions to make change. And we can get Kamala Harris and Joe Biden to commit to making that happen, to making sure that they're supporting those Senate candidates, they're supporting those House of Representative candidates, they're supporting those down ballot candidates, to make sure that we have a government that reflects us. Because at the end of the day, if we don't, then it's not going to change any quicker than it has been in the past. It'll move faster if we have more representation. And we see what coalitions can do. When Black women have been holding the Democratic Party down forever, since we've been able to vote. And this year, they wrote that letter and they said, hey, you need to pick a Black woman to be a vice president. Imagine if we would have did that before, when we were just picking presidential candidates, period. Use that power. If Representative Clyburn would have used his power to write that letter before we got down to Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders. So we need to capitalize on that power that we do have. I mean, we need to recognize where we have power. We need to hold our elected officials accountable. We need to hold candidates accountable. And we need to just stay on them and work to get to a place where we have more power to live out our diversity and our needs. But we have to get to a place where we can do that. And that's important.
And no pandering. We don't need to see Kamala doing electric slide nowhere.
Well, I think that was phenomenal. Thank y'all.
So listen, guys, we can go on. I wish we could go on. We can go on, but we shouldn't. Out of respect for our viewers and our listeners and out of the brand and the show, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We do have to cut it off. Can I just say, number one, thank you guys for your perspective, which is just awesome.
Mm-hmm.
I'm so glad that we have this platform. Hopefully we'll get this, as we do every week, we'll get thousands and thousands of viewers, and the things that you guys say will resonate with with the voting population. Just to put a cap on this, I think that what the Republican Party does better, and where they are winning in some respects, even winning the war, is some of the things that you talk about, like the debt forgiveness and the anti-racist policies and the COVID response, which is financial. Some of these things are happening as a result of who we vote for locally. Local elections, local representatives that go to the House, local representatives that go to the Senate. That's where that happens, because what your buddy is doing right now, and he understands, is he is going to say, I'm going to do an executive order that tells y'all that I'm going to do shit that I don't even have the power to do, but I'm going to sign an executive order anyway. Why? Because he knows that there's so many people out there hearing it that they're automatically going to assume that he's fighting for me, and he's doing what. And in actuality, he's not doing anything but doing what he does best, which is marketing. So I don't know whether the answer is that the Democratic techniques does do the same thing or what, but the reality is that we have to get better at understanding how this game actually works. So having said that, DeMar, we're gonna be keeping up with you're gonna see my stuff. I'm gonna do it socially. My54.org. I'm doing my 54 miles, brother. Alicia, Brian, fam, I love y'all. Jasmine, from joining us all the way from California in law school. Don't you ever take 4 hours out of your day again. As long as you're in law school, you're supposed to be studying. No, you ain't got time to be out here.
Black lawyers have to be social engineers. She doing her social engineering today. So we appreciate all of you all for joining us. You all tune in next week. If you are local, if you are in Florida, there is an election on Tuesday. Please go vote. And we will be keeping up these conversations about this upcoming election. So we thank you all for joining us, and y'all be blessed.
Take care.
Wherever we go, we about to bring on the positive vibe.